5. Monday, 11th of August 2025. Awakening was never easy. No matter the hours that had passed, be they of any quality or quantity, a groggy miasma of sluggish inertia clung to Locrian like so many cobwebs. He was aware of the cold, aware that it had troubled him for the entire night, and despite there being simple solutions to his malady, he lay languid in the bone-cold dawn, listening to the wind chimes that had plagued his dreams. A window had been left open, and he was unsure if it had been he who had done this, or if he had neglected to notice it upon his late arrival the previous evening. "Dad, close the window." But no one would respond. He was alone, and any voices that weren't his own were nothing but chemical impulses triggering memories in his brain. "Close that door, Leah. Do we live in a tent?" The door slammed. "Without the attitude, please." Lockie left it open. "And I'm asking you to close it. Thank you." The curtains fluttered restlessly until he clasped the window shut, and they returned to their inert vigil, the call of the wind chimes becoming muffled. There was a claw-like tear in the fly screen. His father had never replaced them. And through this sinister incision, Locrian observed the crisp morning, the frost-cloaked grass glistening in the dawn, the magpies warbling glissando, and the vast valley that stretched out from his father's old house on the hill. "I thank God for another day." He muttered his mantra every morning he could remember, though some days it was more difficult than others. Today he was undecided. The tragedy of his father's passing had lent him a cloak of understandable melancholy, yet for a moment, amongst the icy glass of morning, after the wind-tossed nightmares of the evening past, Locrian allowed this moment's respite to shiver down his spine and raise his shoulders somewhat. The house was a ramshackle edifice, rustic and roughshod in its construction, pertaining somewhat to the artisanal style of homes found in the bushlands of Australia. Timber and rust abound. It propped itself up on old bones of ironbark, surveying the hillside from a perch halfway up the slope. Here its wooden facade and corrugated tin roof had weathered the gusts of the Highland winters and the scorching horror of its summer sun alike. Although it stood 2 stories tall, it was not a large residence, and most of the ground floor was occupied by a combined kitchen and living room, where every other room seemed like an afterthought tacked onto the facade. A mudroom along the southern side, a study to the west, and on the eastern side, next to the kitchen no less, was a bathroom. The location of the water tanks was the most likely reasoning behind this bizarre setup, and Locrian recalled the awkward feeling of showering while his father or sister were cooking food on the other side of the wall. Although he had returned to his childhood home many times in the past, he was always struck by how much larger he felt. He had experienced a similar feeling in Braidwood the day before, a giant stamping around a toy block scene. He wondered what Leah would think of it, what memories she'd stoke when she arrived, for she had moved to Adelaide upon the threshold of adulthood. As for Locrian, it had been some 5 years gone since he'd last made the trip down from Sydney. Lockie shuffled to the kitchen with the moribund reflections of his past glinting dimly in the recesses of his mind. He was thankful to see the refrigerator had been emptied of perishables. Either a neighbour must have done it, or perhaps his father had anticipated his own demise. Yet his father hadn't been so old, 67 to be said, and he had always been a man of sturdy health, although perhaps his stoicism had hidden a submerged torment of body. It fascinated Lockie to observe the pastoral picture of his father's kitchen and ponder the final movements of the old man. The lid of the coffee jar screwed on for the last time, the plates stacked neatly on their rack, never to be used again. With a magician's precision, he thoughtfully slid a few coffee cups about in the side cupboard, though it really didn't matter which one he took for himself. For a moment, his gaze fell on an ugly mug, misshapen and deformed, and he recognised it as the Father's Day gift he'd made in the second grade. He felt his grief emerge once more as he clutched the sad little thing. The stains ringing the bottom of it belayed the amount of use his father had gotten from it. Locrian could not believe he'd kept it for so long. He put the cup back. He couldn't look at it again. The crunch of the coffee beans skittered into the grinder, and the rising aroma was reward in itself. Hand over lever, white knuckles curled. Those modern automatic grinders could never compete. Good coffee was always worth working for. Counterclockwise he turned it, filling the drawer with caffeinated stardust. Locrian thought of clockwise, and how the right way to turn seemed at odds with the very cosmos itself. For man knew that the earth spun in the opposite direction, and the planets too, gauche. If that wasn't the perfect allegory of humanity's defiance against God, he didn't know what was. He was not expected in Goulburn until mid-morning, and the drive would take him about an hour. Lockie was almost grateful for the troubled night's sleep, as his early rising would allow him to take his time. The cold morning air sank its fangs into him as he slipped the glass doors of the living room open and stepped out onto the patio, his breath intertwined with the rising steam of his copy. It was a stunning scene, blissfully quiet. Only the birds and the wind intruded upon the silence. The valley had not yet shed the blue residue of the dawning, and would not take on its greens and browns until the sun climbed a little higher. Locrian's feet felt frozen, yet he found the sensation to be rather exhilarating. When struck by the cold, he was reminded of his position as a creature of blood, alive. How could it be that such a paradisial scene foreshadowed the task that lay before him? The immediate arrangement of his father's affairs, and beyond, an uncertain future where the man who'd acted anchor for Lockie would no longer be there. When he considered this, the pleasant house on the hill took on a sinister air, the dawn hues of blue and violet concealing pernicious intent. This was little more than a Potemkin village, a charlatan ready to unravel at the first pluck of loose thread. He turned his head to the sound of an owl who'd clearly stayed up later than its brethren, and gazed up the slope to the trees that towered at the summit. Recalling his dream, Lockie furrowed his brow to observe the divots interspersing the grass in a clumsy line following the incline. Footprints. The trail dotted back to the house, where they terminated at his own muddy boots. Inside, beside the sofa bed. Had he gone wandering in his sleep? Surely not. He'd never been somnambulant before, at least not to his knowledge. Yet the vivid recollection of the spectre he'd seen and the undeniable trail he'd left of his own volition left no doubt. Yet he'd vehemently deny anything of the supernatural. He could certainly attribute a bout of somnambulance to the heavy nature of the situation. And the apparition? A mere hallucination, his anema haunting his dreams. Still though, he thought he might explore the top of the hill later that afternoon. The coffee had gone cold, yet he drank it anyway, clinging to its promise of vivacity like it were a life raft. Turning himself inside, he stood in silence for a moment and breathed deeply of the creaking timber of his old home, the familiar smell, the aura of its void. It was a house that had swallowed many secrets and taunted of buried joy and horror alike. It was distinctly uncomfortable to be in a place from his past, as though he were intruding on old grounds where he no longer belonged. We know Lockie the child. This is his place. Who are you? The stairwell to the second floor wound itself up from the living room into a sort of loft where 3 bedrooms lay. The twisted steps creaked beneath his feet as he ascended this trunk to canopy. There was an anteroom at the summit of the steps, where the ceiling sloped and a large skylight threw sunbeams across the dust motes that floated ad infinitum. His father had set up his telescope there, alongside a rather decrepit chair that looked almost comical next to the opulent brass of the device. Locrian had always disliked the position of his bedroom, lining up directly across from the stairs, as he'd lay in bed with a direct view of the unknown that might lurk just a few steps below. To him, either there was something there, or nothing at all, and both ideas terrified him as a boy. These days, there was nothing orderly about the bedroom. His father had used his children's vacated bedrooms as little more than storage spaces. In fact, the entirety of the second floor gave off the impression that it had not been in use for many years. Perhaps his father had migrated to the more accessible parts of the house in his advancing age. Lockie's bedroom was the worst offender, having gained walls within walls as furniture and boxes were stacked haphazardly. He could liken its traversal to the Minotaur's labyrinth. Remaining, though, was a ruinous piano, the same one that Lockie had spent hours playing in his childhood, too big to move with him when he'd rented his first flat in Sydney after his 18th birthday. A paisley patterned rug had done little to prevent the dust mounted on the instrument, which groaned as he lifted the lid to reveal the yellowed ivory keys beneath. A rush of nostalgia flew over him. No doubt he'd be woefully out of practice, having switched from playing music in recent years to merely writing it. It had stimulated different parts of his brain to learn his theory, and aside from the occasional strum on his old acoustic guitar, Lockie hadn't played anything musically for what felt like an eternity. He let his fingers glide lightly across the keys before depressing one of them, a B note, and he knew already that the piano was horribly out of tune. Pressing each second key in a line, he sounded out a D, F, and A, forming a dissonant, half-diminished chord, made all the more jarring by the tuning of the instrument. The sound was monstrous after years of reticence, and he didn't care enough to give the chord a resolution. Any other tonality would have done the trick. The tonic chord of his namesake was left to hang in the room where dust and decay had taken root. He would play no more. Needed no reassurance of his ability or knowledge. He'd long since given up the need to impress or prove to anybody, including himself. Maybe now that he'd soon be disposing of his father's possession, he could finally move the piano to his flat and start playing consistently again. Or maybe he'd just let it go along with the rest of the junk. Locrian couldn't ever decide what was worth keeping and what should be forgotten. There was no reason for him to venture into his sister's old room, for it was of similar ilk, lined from floor to ceiling with boxes. The anteroom at the top of the stairs held the only area of seemingly lived-in space, a few square metres where his father had set up the telescope. The warmth that radiated from this sunny corner almost had Lockie smiling. A star chart and notepad crowded a small coffee table where an unwashed coffee cup sat. His father must have sat there very recently. The chair strategically aligned with the flue that rose from the fireplace downstairs, the heat radiating off its steel chimney, would have been pleasant to the old man on winter evenings. For Locrian, he'd held an aversion to the chimney, having once burnt his hand on its surface as a child. The star maps made no sense to him. The cosmos always fascinated him, although he'd never had the patience to learn the nuances the way his dad had. It was a fiddly, intricate hobby, one that suited his dad perfectly. But for Lockie, spending painstaking minutes lining up the telescope on a dot of light millions of miles away simply didn't hold as much thrill. You can't even see the rings properly. Sure you can. You can see them right there. Look. Clearer pictures in books, though. Pfft, you kids. No appreciation. That there is a planet 10 times the diameter of Earth. You're looking at it. Weird how it's so small to us. It's because it's so far away. Consider that distance. It's awe-inspiring. And to think that the next planet in line after that is twice as far away. Can't even be seen without a telescope. It lay in darkness until we first saw it recently. 1700s, son. Why do you like this stuff so much? His dad paused and thought. Because it grounds me, mate. There's a duplicity to it that I can't get my head around. That we're so small, yet so special, so insignificant, so miraculous. An insignificant miracle. There's no other way to put it. Profound. You're sarcastic now, Locke. You're young. But it's true. And some people lean more into insignificance. Some choose to read more into the miraculous. One way is definitely easier than the other.